plague has ravished this land for eons, receding into the shadows for brief moments only to rear its head during eras of change. These are the things that Cassie would say when she did speak.
I'm Addae and I'm the writer of Cassie's Ballad. Cassie's Ballad is an immersive ritual and historical fable that uses the lens of the Atlanta missing and murdered children's case from the early 80s. I describe the piece as a ritual and not a play because they're not passively getting the story and witnessing information. They're actually a part of it and engaged in helping the characters to both commemorate the tragedy of what occurred and what is also still occurring, but also hopefully engaging in this ritual hopefully gives them some solace as well from the tragedies that we've been experiencing as of late. Hey, welcome everyone. I guess we're getting this party started. My name is Addae. I'm one of the co-founders of Hush Harbor Lab, and I'm also the playwright on a project that Hush Harbor Lab is working and collaborating with Found Stages called Cassie's Ballad. Before we begin our conversation about the project, we want to thank the Fulton County Arts Council and Culture, the Fulton County Board of Commissioners, the Counter Narrative Project, and the Georgia Council for the Arts for their donations and their support of this project and the work that we do. I think we're about to see a little clip of the promotional video for the project, and then we're going to start our conversation with one of the founders of the Counter Narrative Project, Charles Stephens, to talk a little bit about the project, about the work that they do, and how these two organizations, or three organizations, are intersecting for this narrative. Hey, Charles, what's going on, man?
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, how's it going? I guess we're going to see the video later. But yeah, could you tell everybody that's watching a little bit about yourself and about the Counter Narrative Project?
Sure. Well, I've always been interested in the arts, and I've been committed to social justice really for as long as I can remember, having this consciousness about the world around me. But there were very few platforms I saw in the city where I thought I could bring all the parts of myself together and all of my interests. And so I really founded the Counter Narrative Project, or CNP, as a way to create a platform to bring my commitment and passion to the arts and my commitment and passion to social justice together. Our belief is that narratives not only have a programmatic function, not only have an important educational awareness function, we believe in narrative as an intervention, narrative as approach, narrative as a worldview. And so CNP was really built from that, and really just wanting to create an institution, a political home that could amplify the voices of particularly Black gay men, but the broader Black LGBTQ community in the pursuit of racial justice, social justice, and liberation.
Man, that's fantastic. That's fantastic.
And I think my next question is for you. Yeah. Tell the viewers about you as a playwright, theater artist, and your connection to Found Stages and Hush Harbor Lab.
Well, I'm the co-founder of Hush Harbor Lab with the wonderful Amina McIntyre. And I've been an artistic associate with Found Stages since their inception. So it's been, I can't even remember the number of years. So it's been a very long time. We've collaborated on a lot of projects together. Cassie's Ballad was a part of a larger collaborative project that we worked on together to really kind of find a way to develop three intersecting narratives that sort of told something about the city and about Atlanta. And so Cassie's Ballad was one of those narratives. And the idea for it came from another play that I was working on, but it sort of fit within the context of the big project that we had was called The Council of Lions. And so, other than writing immersive plays and ritual experiences, I'm a playwright professor at Clark Atlanta University, and I'm the associate artistic director at Theatrical Outfit in downtown Atlanta. So, wearing a lot of hats right now. And now, you have a very interesting personal narrative that's related to the Atlanta missing and murdered children's case, which is really one of the inspirations for Cassie's Ballad. Could you talk a little bit about that and how your connection to this really important historical event, tragedy that altered the city, how that impacts the work that you do?
Well, my family, like certainly other families that were in the city in the early 1980s, was directly impacted by the Atlanta missing and murdered children, because one of the missing and murdered children was someone that was part of my family. It was a cousin of mine. His body was found, I believe, 2 months after I was born. So my family being impacted was both an interesting, or it gave me a lot of insights about the ways that families can be impacted by collective trauma, the ways that families can be impacted by, just in terms of both what's said and what's not said, the ways that it's symbolized, the ways that it's represented. So for example, I grew up in a house where I really didn't hear, and it's so strange now looking back that I didn't really hear, even though I was born and was a Black boy in that era, I didn't really hear anything about it. Like, I don't remember my family talking about it, except for there was a newspaper clip in our family album with this boy named Charles Stephens. And even before I could read it, like, I just remember this clipping, but it was never introduced. It was never pointed out. It was just there. My mother, who never, ever, ever spoke about the Atlanta child murders, put it in there because she was the one that curated the family albums. So I thought how interesting that this woman who was pregnant with me while this was happening never talked to me about it, never said anything about it. But in our family album, there was this clipping that was never explained to me. As I was a little older, around 11 or 12, my father started talking to me about it finally. He told me, he was like, when you were being born, we were really afraid because we didn't, if this is what was happening, but I didn't really have a concept for it, right? So I'm 11 or 12 at this point. So I don't have any historical context, any political context, didn't really know anything about it. But my dad was telling me that when I was born, these, in his words, these Black boys were being murdered. And so that was just something that was in the back of my mind. So as I got older, as I got in college, I started learning more about what was really happening and just the mood of the city. And it became something that really animated my imagination in terms of, again, thinking through the ways that individual lives and families and relationships can really be shaped by trauma in all of these ways, and how it impacts how it impacts people's experiences, and just the profound silence in so many ways in the city around what was happening.
No. It's interesting that you should mention that, because my experience and awareness of it, I was very young when it was happening, but and I could read barely, but I remember vividly picking up Jet magazine each month, and each month they would have a description of the child that was found. And I can also remember watching news reports on the news and my parents rushing to turn the television off whenever one of the bodies were found or discovered. And then also hearing people adults mostly whisper about what was happening in the city. And my aunt is lived here for years. And we used to come up to Atlanta every summer to visit her. And suddenly those visits stopped. And I didn't return to the city again until I was a teenager. Um, it's really interesting how the press, and in this case with me, it was the Black press in particular, how that really was, for me, it was an introduction to the story, but it was also, I grew up in a working class Black neighborhood, so everybody was Black. And so I didn't really have a concept of race outside of the folks in my hood. And so this idea of Black bodies being at risk was something that was really new to me. And once I became aware of what that meant, and that there was a particular danger in inhabiting a Black body, I I can say that the event totally changed the course of my life. Um, and I think for a lot of Black folks growing up in that time period as well.
Yeah, I mean, there were bits and pieces here and there that I received over the years. Like I had an older brother that I remember telling me that the CDC, now mind you, this is maybe when I was 12, maybe 10 or 11, I think. He would tell me these stories about how the CDC would snatch Black boys and experiment on their bodies. Like this is out of the
Oh, I mean, that was one of the conspiracy theories.
yeah,
That was
all the
like one of the
conspiracy theories,
big,
right? And I remember hearing the
yeah.
story. Now, he didn't connect it to the Atlanta missing murdered children. He was just saying that. So there are these
Mhm.
bits and pieces. And as I got older, I had this friend that, like, I remember, and then just certain narratives specifically around it. Like I remember hearing one friend telling me that he was sort of the age. He was very much of the era. So he was like in the early '80s. He was in high school. And he said something like, "Yeah, my parents told me that." We didn't have anything to worry about because they were only targeting poor children, and we were middle class, and we're the Black middle
Wow.
class, and we're
Right.
higher heights, and we don't have to worry about that. And so, I mean, there were just these messages that I would receive, and eventually, all of the message that I received, I started to put together into a singular narrative about what was happening, and that's when it became, especially in terms of just thinking about, again, just collective, how Atlanta constitutes what's remembered, and how the
Mm.
individuals that get to tell the story and the ones that don't get to tell the story, and the people that, and this is kind of connected, I think, to what you were saying around the Black bodies, right, and the dangers, the violence done to Black bodies. For me, I would actually take it to, I mean, growing up, I did have a sense, not so much of I don't think I had an analysis around the violence on the Black bodies, but I do remember there being a kind of structural vulnerability that I was very aware of, and that there's something about there was something about life where I knew that life itself was yeah, everything just seemed very, very, very there was just like a vulnerability to everything. I do remember being very
Mm.
aware of that.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned because it's something people never really talk about as it relates to uh, the missing and murdered children, the whole class aspect of it. That people really like that was such a is such a dominant part of that story. And people never really talk about that. Why do you think that is? And how important is it for us to kind of lean in on that part of the narrative as well?
Well, I imagine there are those that would say that class had nothing to do with it, so I'm definitely want to create space for that.
Acknowledge that, yeah.
I will say that in terms of the narratives that yeah, there was a class aspect,
Mhm.
absolutely. And I'll just say my experience of growing up in Atlanta, growing up in Adamsville, I was very aware as I got older about the class structure of Atlanta, the class structure of Black Atlanta, and where I fit in that.
Mhm.
And definitely learning early on that there were some spaces that I would not be accepted. There were some spaces I remember, like, just finally starting to recognize some of the hierarchies that existed. And so when you look at something, and so we look at, how there are certain people in the city that are extremely vulnerable, even today, I think it does necessitate an analysis of class that I think is often not really, especially as it intersects with race, right? I think
Right.
that I used to say, I remember having a conversation with a colleague, and I was, there's always been this perception that Atlanta has all these possibilities for Black folks. Even my parents used to say that. My parents would always say, my dad was from Georgia, but or my dad was actually from Atlanta, grew up in Summerhill, but both my parents ended up moving up north when they were very young. So they came back to Atlanta in the early 70s. And my parents would talk about how there are all these possibilities for Black folks, and just being so inspired and so excited by that Atlanta of the early 70s. Now, that's not an Atlanta that I've known. The Atlanta I grew up in, there were not those possibilities in the same way.
Right, right,
But
right.
what I will say is that, there's this perception of Atlanta as the Black Mecca, right? And I mean, one of the things that became clear to me early on is that perhaps Atlanta is the Black Mecca, but not necessarily for poor and working class Black people. And that was just something I understood very early on, that there are just these really important class dynamics. And again, I think that when we talk about Atlanta missing and murdered children, it does. I think it does invite us to lean into an intersectional analysis, particularly as it relates to class and perhaps even homophobia, but that we can talk about that too.
Right, right.
Just in terms of like what, if we're going to really, I think, try to understand how this happened in the city and any lessons learned that we can extract, which is why I was really excited by your work, I guess, which brings us to our conversation today, because I really felt like it was a narrative that really, it didn't seem sensationalistic. It definitely seemed to center the humanity of the individuals involved in a way that I've really seen it. It didn't seem like it was diminishing the dignity and the humanity of the folks that were impacted. And I thought that was really beautiful and important.
Great. I mean, thanks, man. I appreciate that. I mean, one of the things I really wanted to lean in as I was creating Cassie's ballad was that while I was using, the missing and murdered children as sort of the foundation, sort of the jumping off point, I really wanted it to be a piece that was a healing ritual. And that wasn't simply about, telling this very traumatic story, but also giving the audience and the people experiencing it, because it is an immersive piece. It takes place outdoors. The audience is a part of the experience. I really wanted to make sure that it was an opportunity for us to look at this historical moment, but see it as a jumping off point to really explore how, from the first time we got off of those boats, how our bodies have been endangered. And while those concerns are ongoing, I mean, Black bodies are at risk at this very moment. We've also found ways to create spaces for healing, love, and liberation with all of those potential dangers a part of our experiences as well. So I'm hoping that what people come away with from the experience is that they get a little bit of history about the events of the missing and murdered children, but that they also realize that one of the powers of Black culture and Black community in general is our ability to deal with these tragedies, but to also transcend and heal ourselves, but also hopefully grow and evolve from these experiences as well.
Absolutely. I suppose we should dig back into the questions. Let's see.
Yeah.
I think we've answered many of them.
I think we've already addressed them all.
We have talked about inspiration, but I guess maybe it might be helpful to let folks know how we met or how this all came together.
Yeah.
I think I got this. So I received an invitation to attend the lab that you were a part of.
The
Riser's lab at the Alliance Theater. I got an invitation to attend, and I was like, I don't know if I want to go, and I'm working all day and I'm tired. Sure, I'll go.
Right.
Fine, I'll go. Not really knowing what to expect. I don't even think I really knew what immersive theater was really. But I was like, sure, I'll check it out. And I went to the Alliance Theater, and all of the projects were really great and really interesting. And I think I read a description about Cassie's Ballad, and I think usually I think that there's space for all kinds of stories and all kinds of writers. And I applaud anyone that's willing to write about difficult subjects, write about painful subjects, especially
Right.
subjects that are very politically charged, such as the Atlanta missing murdered children. I also admire any writer that's willing to confront collective trauma and take up the mission to excavate some kind of community remembrance, right? Even the things that are too difficult for us to remember, but still must be faced, right? But a lot of I haven't always connected to some of those representations of that moment for a variety of reasons. And there have been
Right.
many, many, many stories, many, many attempts to try to tell the story of what was happening in Atlanta in that time. Haven't always connected on a deep level, but again, applaud them, but just haven't always connected. But then I saw your project or your work, and I was like, this is what's needed. I mean, I was just moved and probably somewhat emotional just by the forcefulness and just how powerful it was and the beautiful language. I mean, because how do you put language into how do you describe trauma through language? And I just thought you were able to use this very beautiful. I hope that I know sometimes the call writing lyrical, especially for Black writers, can be charged, but it was just this very beautiful kind of writing, right? Just very beautiful language that was used to represent. And I thought this is exactly how it just felt like such the appropriate way to have characters narrate their experience, like the kind of language that you used then. Just the metaphors that manifested in the work, and I just was really impressed. So I was like, I have to meet you. I have to know. Well, I think someone told me I should. Cause I don't think it was direct. I think eventually I was probably ranting about how much I loved it, and then someone was like, "Oh, you should reach out. Like, I'll do an introduction." And I was like, "Oh, wow, sure, okay." And that is how. And I think that singular event of us connecting around this work was probably what put into motion this conversation today.
Yeah. What are aspects of the story that you think people need to know about that probably haven't been covered in some of the other attempts at trying to tell the story of the missing and murdered children?
Well, one of the things that I didn't learn as much about until way later on was just how organized and forceful the parents were, particularly the mothers early on, and how
Mothers, oh my God,
defiant, how they had to speak truth to power, the kinds of narratives about them that they were having to create counter narratives around. Because there was, I think, some of the really awful, horrible narratives were like they were bad parents, bad mothers, and that's why, basically trying to blame individuals for these structural failures. Because I really do think that part of the story of the Atlanta missing murdered children is a series of structural failures as well. Not the failures of individual behavior, not the failures of individuals, but the failure of governance and the failure of structures in the city to keep these children safe. But there were many of those narratives, and so they had to organize and they had to fight these, really. I mean, I don't even know what it took for them to be able to do that while they're grieving. And I just took so much inspiration from just the organizing of the parents, particularly the mothers, and just the analysis of class. Like, I think you also see some of the race and class analysis in some of the messaging and interviews. And so it was really incredible. So I think that's absolutely a story. So I think it's, yes, the story that we all still grieve and we are all still very impacted by, which is the deaths of these children. But I also think that it's also an important story about parents and mothers organizing and really being defiant in the face of an incredible bureaucracy, very, very incredible bureaucracy. And I think there are lessons that can be learned. I mean, I think, in my opinion, and I'm sure there are historians that may disagree with me on this, but I think some of the most powerful community organizing that we've seen was through the parents, in the early 80s, and really getting the city to pay attention to them, because the city wasn't, quite frankly. And also having to navigate a power structure that was populated by people that looked like them, and them having to have hard conversations with those people in power. And so I definitely encourage, people in Atlanta that want to do organizing work, that are looking for historical examples, particularly post-civil rights, that is absolutely something that they should be looking to, because I think there's so much inspiration there. Another story that's often not told, and I don't know how deep we want to get on this. I'm not even sure if this is necessarily appropriate for this audience, but I do feel like I talk about just like when you look at a lot of the, and this is probably jumping ahead a little bit, but I've always been surprised that the homophobia that we see in the initial coverage, and not really all of the coverage, the fact that the FBI, before anyone was identified, the FBI and the law enforcement had already determined that they were looking for a Black, they would have said probably homosexual, maybe gay, but a Black gay man as the culprit. Like, that's who they identified. Right. This is before anyone had been identified, before they had even started. They had created a profile, right? And that's just and that's a lot that I think we need to unpack. That was, and I think what it did was it created a particular kind of climate that I think culminated in Wayne Williams's conviction for a host of reasons, in part because I think the prosecution very successfully made the case. Well, they would say they never accused him of being gay, but they essentially, in part, put his sexuality on trial. And I think that the jury responded to that. And I think it created the situation where the defense attorneys were also not only trying to prove that he wasn't responsible for the murders of all of the children that they attached to him, in addition to the 2 that he was actually charged with officially, but also, having, girlfriends testify that they had sex with him just to try to make the case that he was actually heterosexual. So there was just a lot there.
Insane.
Okay, maybe if the homophobia piece, whatever, there's a sense of like masculinity, a certain kind of masculinity being constructed throughout this case. And I've always found it striking that many of the documentaries, I think the Atlanta Monster podcast went there a little bit, but I've always thought that was such an important, if we are to understand that this was an intersectional issue, I think there's just so much there. So those are just 2 pieces that come to mind. I'll say the third thing, and this has just been something that I've sort of faced and experienced, is the city has seemed very committed to amplifying and prioritizing certain kinds of stories, representations, and institutional memory, and not others. And that I find that fascinating, because I think it also holds a mirror up to us. So in terms of who gets to go to the meetings and who gets to be a part, and the kinds of grief and the kinds of mourning that we want to sanction and sort of get behind versus others. I mean, I think that it's interesting, and even myself have faced some gatekeeperism in terms of some of the questions that I've raised, and those are just some of the things that I've noticed. So, about yourself, what do you think? What have you found to be missing from some of these discourses?
I think that the things that you mentioned are really important, and I really want to lean in on the last comment you made about how, Atlanta has this really interesting history of myth making, and there's a tendency, especially when it comes to traumatic events, to want to either ignore them or reframe them. So I'm thinking about, in particular, the race riot of 1906, and how there seems to be a big push now to reframe that as a race massacre, which to me is really problematic, because it actually takes away some of the agency of the Black businesses that established themselves, post 1906. But the dominant myth about the city that I encountered when I first moved here was, Atlanta was a city too busy to hate. And that phrase, a city too busy to hate, I think says a lot about this city's ongoing need to frame itself as being exceptional. And so if you are exceptional, and this goes all the way back to the idea of the New South as well. If you are exceptional, and if a major part of your economy depends on people coming to the city to spend money because it's an exceptional city, there's also a tendency to sort of subvert narratives or to suppress narratives that might challenge that assumption. And I think it definitely happened in the case with the missing and murdered children.
Maybe that's why they squeeze out so many of our Black artists. I mean, Atlanta should
Yeah.
be an incubator for Black art and Black artists and Black creatives. And I've just seen time and time again that it's a very difficult city. And I hope I'm not speaking too out of school here, because but my experience has been based on the communities I've been a part of, just how difficult it is to be a Black artist that wants to kind of hold a mirror up in that way and really provide more of an iconoclastic perspective to some of the myth making, right? And I've just seen so many, really two things. One, just being very difficult for certain kinds of Black creatives who end up having to move because of the lack of arts funding. If you're a funder, I hope you're, I encourage you to support Black artists and Black artistic works. But also, you know, people from Atlanta that grew up here, a lot of us leave and I think what happens when you have so many people being forced to leave, particularly post 1996 Olympics, a lot of that institutional memory leaves. So what makes it possible for myth making to happen? The people that were there can't defy you because they can't afford to live in the city anymore because you moved them out. And so I think with so much mass displacement, both the people that can tell the stories and the people that were there to bear, that could, sort of provide first person testimony. If you move them all out, then it just leaves the people there that can create and construct these myths because no one is there that can dissent.
Yeah, and you know, we do it in a number of ways. We tear down buildings, we change the name of streets. To this day, I don't know what the hell West Midtown is, but apparently that's a thing.
I actually live in West Midtown. Let's talk about that. This I'm brought to you right in West Midtown. It took me a long time to be able to say that because I grew, my father worked in on Perry Boulevard, which is like
yeah.
And so, I spent like my summers with him, like on Perry Boulevard, and it's so bizarre what has taken the place of Perry homes now in that community. So now you have these $400,000 to $500,000 homes that used to be Perry homes, and that's just so bizarre to me. And I wonder where all those people went and all those stories went. Like I remember, and I just have so many memories there. Or even, there's this really gorgeous park, the West Side Park, and I don't know if you've been there, but it's like right over there. And I was like, oh my God, I grew up over here, but it's so different, and it feels sometimes it almost feels like someone pouring cement over your memories and building other things on top of them. And so I was like, I need to start writing stuff down because you said it's like, the street names change, and I get it, right? Street names change, and I have to force myself to call Bankhead, what was Bankhead Highway, Hollowell. I still have to do that.
It will always be Bankhead.
I still call H.E. Holmes train station Hightower. So it's like, that's what you do. It's like that. But I mean, so if we're talking about memory, right? And how do we preserve memory? Right. How do we sustain these memories? I do think for an artist like yourself in Atlanta, I do think that one has the dual role of telling stories, but also preserving memory. And my hope is that, other creatives and other, particularly Black artists, take that mantle. Even folks that weren't born here. I've even become less curious about, being born, being from Atlanta. But I just think it's so important that we preserve some of these stories because, many of the stories that I think we can learn the most from and can tell us the most about who we are and how we got to where we've gotten exist. They're not being told. And so we absolutely need to tell those stories.
Right. And I mean, one of the things that Amina and I talk about a lot, because she's an Atlanta native, is that, this story, there's so many rich, complex, interesting stories and narratives that are directly like within the soil of this city that have yet to be explored. And it seems like it's really important for artists and organizations to sort of pick up the mantles to make sure that these memories are, that have been suppressed or brought to the surface, but also that they're looked at from multiple perspectives, because it would behoove us to, as we try to become this global international city that we are, we also acknowledge all the individuals not all related to the civil rights movement, but all the regular people who have helped make this city the sort of dynamic space it is.
And hopefully the stories will give us the fuel and the inspiration to resist. I mean, I think that's
right.
It is so seductive to be cynical, right? To just say, you know what, they've won, the developers and all the forces that want to push us out, that want to build condos on top of our most beautiful memories, they won, and just give up. It is so tempting. And I think that, but I do think there's something about the arts and particularly the stories that remind us of who we are and that give us a sense of possibility, but also fuel our courage and our resistance and our willingness to dissent, because I think we desperately need dissent, because it could look, I mean, that's the thing about being the dominant culture. You can shape reality in a way that suggests that we always win and you never do, especially we don't know our history and we don't know where we come from. And I think it creates an important opportunity, particularly for Black artists in this city, to figure out ways to tell stories of this city and tell those stories of resistance, those stories and the stories of trauma that people want to, again, pave over. Hopefully, what I hope to be one of the legacy of this collaboration between the Counter Narrative Project and Cassie's Ballad is that it does open the door for more artistic and nonprofit collaborations, because I think Black-led nonprofit organizations and Black artist communities absolutely need each other desperately, and I think that could be the way that we're able to sustain and proliferate our stories.
Right. What stories do you want to see, or what stories are you interested in telling, without giving us your best ideas?
I know but I'm gonna, if you allow me to, I think I'm gonna let you go first on that one. What stories do you want to see? So actually, a story that I'm working on. I am absolutely fascinated by turn of the century, like early 1900s AUC, and that whole sort of like early HBCU university environment, in particular, Adrienne Herndon and her students. So did you read the story that we published on The Reckoning about Norris Herndon?
Oh no!
So I have to send.
I didn't check that out.
I have to send you. We published a story about. I'm sorry to cut you off. Apologize, but it just
seems
no. Because like Norris Herndon is someone that I've been fascinated by, and we actually
Norris is fascinating.
We had it, and his mom. The story, right? The fam. So when you said the early AUC, I'm like, you have the Herndons, and you particularly have Norris Herndon, and so we're on the same. We probably need to talk about that actually, but
we talk about that. But but Adrienne used to do and Du Bois used to do these yearly Shakespeare plays, and so I'm working on a piece about a particular production that happens, but also I wanted to use that piece to explore this idea of respectability politics in the Black community, especially at that particular time, because while you had these young Black people doing Shakespeare, you also had people doing cabarets on Decatur Street at whorehouses. And I always, so I'm trying to find a way to sort of merge those two interesting stories to challenge some of our notions about Black respectability at the turn of the 20th century. So.
Yeah, it's fascinating that you shared that, because one, I keep picturing it. Always part of how I look at, especially that part of Atlanta, it almost seems very Gothic to me. Like you look at these pictures.
Oh yeah,
you have this, very light-skinned family living in this Victorian mansion, and and all the dynamics that with it's. And I'm like, it's cinematic, really. And so it gives us an interesting foundation to think about the evolution of race politics, certainly, but also how the social organization of the city, and I think there's just a lot there, because it's interesting. You said AUC, not just Morehouse and Spelman, which I think sometimes get some connection, but I think that Atlanta University certainly. What does it mean for this? Because Adrienne, she was like the chair of the drama department, right? Was she just in the drama department?
Yep. She started one of the first theater programs in the country. So yeah,
and also was a trained actress, right? Because Alonzo paid.
Trained actress, performer, dabbled in a little passing. I mean, it's just.
Well, yeah, that I know. Yeah, I just have you read the Carol Merritt book about the Herndons?
Oh yeah, no, yeah, I love it. I love it. It's fantastic. It was
a beautifully written book. Yeah.
But also a very proud race woman, though, too. On top of that, she's fascinating.
I don't think are there a lot of stories about W.E.B. Du Bois, his time in Atlanta, and what I mean? I know I know in certain scholarly circles that's probably been written about, but more unpopular. Like he lived in Atlanta. Like I think, and he had this whole presence here, right? at
yeah,
Atlanta.
No, I mean, he you know, most of his work and most of his work in sociology started at the AUC, but no, in terms of popular culture, it really hasn't been explored yet.
I love that story. I hope that you're able to move that forward. It's such an important story. I think broadly, I think I'm really interested in Black people from Atlanta that didn't go to Mays and Douglas, that didn't go to Morehouse and Spelman, that grew up not in the Cassie, like people like, and I feel like so much of the representations, some of the people that get elevated are people that come from those experiences. Even people that might have, or either they class climb, so they might have maybe grown up sort of working class, but they ascend to the cultural elite in the city. But I just think there's so many stories that are the people that like, so where are the people that, you know, went to Adamsville, that grew up in Adamsville and went to Harper, or that just went to, that went to West Fulton High School or went to Archer High School and kind of grew up on that side of town. Like I feel like, and I wonder, like, and more folks have probably come from that experience than the sort of Mays, Doug, Jack and Jill, Morehouse, Spelman, Boulay, Lynx, that world. But I feel like that's so dominant, and I think that that world is really important. I think those stories are important, but I feel like we lose something when when the kind of Atlanta we get to know is only limited to just such a small slice.
Right. And what's fascinating is that we get it in the music, but we don't get it in the literature.
Well, I hope this isn't too controversial. I do wonder sometimes, even the musicians that get elevated, if that's also part of the project of the cultural elite and how they want to. You say myth making, so even in the myth making, many of us also become complicit, right? Because I think on some level, to ascend to a certain level, you have to, I think, become a docile subject in some ways and just say, okay, fine, I'll you know, my success is completely connected to you projecting this image of the city, right? And I mean, but I mean, I think that there's what else? Other stories. I think Atlanta in the '90s, I'm fascinated by. Like, I would love to see more stories of that life in Atlanta, like particularly pre-Olympics '90s. Again, that's very much part of the music. You do see some of that. The music has preserved, particularly music in the '90s, preserved so much of that legacy. But to see more narratives about that. Figures that I'm really interested in. Norris Herndon, I would love to see more written about him. More, I mean, just like that whole era, certainly of the city. Also, I think that James Baldwin's relationship to Atlanta. A colleague of mine told me that James Baldwin, like, he had a really close friend that was a professor of Emory University. Richard Long, I think his name was, at Emory. And I was like, what? James Baldwin had this close friend in Atlanta, and they like would hang out, and you know. So there are these historical figures that I would love to see more stories told about them.
Great. What's coming up for Counter Narrative Project? What's the next big thing you guys are working on?
Counter Narrative Project, the next big thing we're working on. Well, right now we're definitely planning for 2022. We are we're really about to start. We're just about to start planning for a summit that we're hosting in the spring. So we're going to bring our culture workers and artists and storytellers and media makers together to just have a sort of think tank. And so we're really, really excited about that. We also are always looking for stories to amplify and elevate through our online publication, The Reckoning. The Reckoning is a digital platform that seeks to amplify the voices of Black LGBTQ people in Georgia. But and that's where I told you about the Norris Herndon story that we published recently. But so we're always so please check that out. What else? We just wrapped up our 7th anniversary, so we had this commemorative event, CNP at 7, which was an opportunity for us to celebrate our work. So that was something that we're really excited about. And I mean, I think in 2022, we'll just constantly seek to support culture, support the arts, support culture workers, support activists, support the growth and development of political homes for folks, and really just try to be a voice, particularly advocating for the communities that we're accountable to.
Well, Charles, thank you for taking this time to talk with me about this history, about this project, about the ongoing project, and making sure that some of these stories about both about the city, but also about our culture are brought to the surface, and for all the amazing work that Counter Narrative Project does. So everyone watching, check out the Reckoning website and keep an eye out for upcoming projects by this really, really important organization, the Counter Narrative Project.
Thank you.
Thank you, man.